All right, third time's the charm. So we're trying to deploy our CDK-boundary solution. So here we've got CDK-boundary, which is a directory, and you can think of this as a little repository. So repository is just a collection of code artifacts. So here you can see the code artifacts, and these are all of the different things. So you've got a README document, you've got requirements.txt, you've got stacks. So these are all the Python components. So all of these together form a CDK solution, that is AWS Cloud Development Kit solution. And they're designed to build out cloud formation templates and complete working solutions. So here what we're trying to build is a solution which will define our permission boundaries in the production account. So permission boundaries are simply a fenced off area of the production account where analytics will have permissions to deploy AWS resources into without impacting the rest of the organization. So it's kind of a mitigation strategy. All right, so the first step is we want to somehow get this directory, CDK-boundary, and copied or uploaded into code commit. So this is our AWS account, and we want to save a copy of the repository into code commit. Then after we've actually got the code uploaded to code commit, then we want to look into how can we deploy this code. So the next thing is getting a pipeline up and working. Then once we've got the pipeline up and working, we want to get the pipeline to deploy the solution. Now, the pipeline will consist of code pipeline resources, which will manage the different steps and stages to deployment. But in those stages, we'll be using things like code build to do the building process of the code to a CloudFormation template. And I'll be also doing some unit tests. So in this scenario, we're going to be doing some permission testing. Then we're also going to be using CloudFormation for the deployment activities. So multiple stages, quite simply, it's going to be build and then test, and then we're going to be deploying using CloudFormation into our environment. All right. So what we normally do first is I've got my code here. So I can go to my terminal. And here I've got the matching directory location, which is just on my desktop, downloads, and CDK boundary. And I can list it all out. And if I just type in code full stop, this will activate Visual Studio Code. And here it's just opened up a new IDE or development environment for me to start working. Here at the bottom, I've got my terminal. And then all I need to do is I need to start to set up this environment so I can start running CDK commands. So the first thing I need to do is install or set up my environment. So first thing, I want to create a new virtual environment. So I'll be using Python for all of these things. And my virtual environment, you can think of it as I've got my PC, right? And I've installed Python on it. Now, my installation of Python, can think of that as the workstation Python environment. Now, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to set up an environment specific for this repository. And so that's why we see a venv directory within this repository. You can also go back out here and you can still see it's also created there. All right. So in my workstation environment, I've got the following packages that I installed. So these are Python packages. And for my CDK solution, I'm going to need packages specific to CDK. So instead of installing these packages, these CDK packages on my workstation Python environment, I want to install it on the environment that is specific to this repository. So first thing is to switch to my virtual environment that I've just created. So if I run this, so VM scripts activate, so that actually goes into here and then runs that little batch file. So that's these files all generated by this command up here. And so here you can see that I've now switched to the virtual environment. Now if I run pip list again, I should see the same sort of packages installed, because it just simply takes a photocopy of the existing workstation environment. So this is the workstation environment, and here I'm listing the virtual environment. So next thing is I want to install all the required libraries that are listed in the requirements file. So this is a bit special in that I've not listed the libraries in the requirements file. It's kind of empty, but what this one actually does, it looks in the setup.py and then installs all of these packages. So you can see that I'm installing the CDK core libraries, code pipeline, and pipeline libraries. I'm also installing things like AWS-IAM-tester, because when I'm testing all the permissions that I'm creating, I want to try and use the AWS simulator to actually verify, does my permissions that I've written out actually work as I expect them to. So if we go here, you can see all the libraries, and they're slowly getting added at the moment. And so what's happening is the command that I've just run is installing all these different packages into my repository environment. So this doesn't affect my workstation environment. My workstation environment still remains relatively clean with only, I believe it was pip and setup tools. But now in my repository environment, I'm going to have a bucket load more of libraries installed. And that's what it's doing right now. Okay, so now it's done. So if I run pip list and I'm in my repository virtual environment, this one should give me 20 or so different packages now. So you can see they're all listed up here, and there's all the CDK libraries installed. Okay. So next thing is, now I've got my environment set up. The first command is normally cdk ls. So cdk ls is just to list all of the different CDK stacks. So a stack is a collection of AWS resources. And so when that one runs cdk ls, what it normally does is it goes and references, I think it's, okay, cdk.json, and it runs this command. So what's the app? The app command is python space app.py. So it's telling me the first entry point for this CDK command goes into app.py. App.py, here it starts to import a whole bunch of different solutions, and you've got different stacks here. Okay, so without looking at the code, if we look at the results here, so my cdk ls command has listed out all the different, I guess, stacks that can be deployed in the solution. So this is kind of broken down into three main components. Let me just clear this out and run this again. So remember how we've got the repository, the code commit repository that we want to create to save our application code. Then we've got a pipeline to take the application code and deploy it. And then you've got the final one, which is the deployed resources. So if you just look at some of these things, you've got the repository. So here it's been set up in a way that you've got repository, So it kind of labels the type of stack that it is, the name of the repository. So we're working with Cdk-boundary, and then the account that this deployment is specific to. So because of each AWS account is possibly set up differently, we're going to have to, I guess, create different setup parameters for each of these different accounts. All right, so you've got sets for the repository deployed into 3 different accounts. We're only going to be deploying into the one ending in 310. So we go back to Visual Studio Code, that's this one. And then also we're going to be deploying a pipeline. So the pipeline is up here. You've got all the pipelines outlined above. So this is this one. So in this example, we're just going to be working with the cross-account branch. So in a repository, you have multiple branches. Normally you'd have a master branch, which is the main, I guess, verified set of code. And then in a repository, you have photocopies or different versions of the same application. And those are considered to be branches. Now, since this code is still working in development, it's still within the cross-account branch at the moment. So here we've got our pipeline. We've got the name of the repository, so Cdk-boundary. We've got the name of the branch, so cross-account. And then we've got the target account that we want to deploy our pipeline into. Okay, so those are the 2 things that we want to deploy in this demonstration. Now below you can see there's a whole number of other things that have been mentioned. So what these are is, even though you've got just the repository, so the code, you've got the pipeline, the steps that it takes to deployment, you've got all of these things listed down below, which is also the deployed artifacts. So if you think of a pipeline, it takes your code, builds your code, tests your code, then deploys a version into your account, and then might deploy another copy into staging, and then another copy into production. If you just focus on pipeline, Cdk boundary, cross account, and the 310 account, then you can see that these 3 lines are now showing the, I guess, deployed stacks also. So not only it shows you the pipelines, but you can see that the pipeline will also be deploying a copy to development, production, and staging. And then this is the name of the stack that is getting deployed. So you can do it two different ways. You can deploy the repository, you can deploy the pipeline, and the pipeline will go ahead and deploy these 3 stages, or you can also just deploy directly and say without the repository or the pipeline, you can deploy the stacks themselves directly. Okay, so we won't take that shortcut just yet. So the first bit is, okay, Cdk deploy. So all it is Cdk deploy and the name of the stack that you want to deploy. So I'm deploying the 310 solution. My current workstation has already been authenticated into this account using this profile in my command line. So if you type in, so you can see that my workstation already runs against this account. And so it's starting to deploy the resources. So this one is just the repository themselves. So I'm looking at CloudFormation. If I refresh, you can see that now I've got a new stack, a new CloudFormation stack deployed. If I click it, I've got a repository that's been created, and it's an AWS code commit repository. I go over to here. And so now I've got a new code commit repository. All right, so this is a blank repository. Next, we want to upload or push all of our code repositories into code commit. I'm going to try and push all the branches. Okay, so now it's asking for my code commit credentials. And these are specific to the code commit service. These are not the AWS access keys and secret access keys. All right, so that is trying to upload all of the branches into my newly created code commit repository. So that's all uploading. Shouldn't take too long. All right, that's done. If we just refresh this page, now we should have all of the code copied up. All right, so if we look over at our cross-account branch, we've now got a copy of all the same files and artifacts that we've got locally here. So we don't have these two files because these are kind of working directories, but we've got everything else. All right, so now we've got our repository uploaded. Next is we want to deploy the pipeline. So for this example, I'm just going to be deploying the pipeline that looks after the cross-account branch. So there's actually a separate pipeline for each branch. So this is to allow parallel development. Sometimes you might have a team working in Team A branch and then another team working in Team B branch. You want to allow them to have their code separated and deployed independently so they're not stepping on each other's toes during development. When they're ready and they've got everything working, then they can come together and try to merge all of their changes. All right, so this is where we're going to be deploying the pipeline. So Cdk Deploy the name of the thing that we're deploying. So we've got pipeline, Cdk boundary, cross-account branch, and then the 310 account. All right, so here it's just listing a whole bunch of things in terms of permissions that need to be provisioned. I'm just going to say, yes, I'm okay with that. Now it's going to start the CloudFormation creation. So we've got our repository here. Now we should have, we can ignore these ones. These are an old script that I created. All right, now we've got the solution that's been deployed in here, and now it's going through the process of deploying it. All right, so I just skimmed over the, I guess, CloudFormation template that has been deployed, and this is the pipeline. Now, this pipeline is actually being generated by this solution, and going back here. So we've got our repository. This is the template. The template is actually, if you want a copy of that, you can see it in cdk.out. And if I expand this a bit, Here you can see that I've got the repository, CDK boundary, and the 310 assets is any file assets that are being uploaded in the process. But we are looking at this one. So this is just the CloudFormation template for this stack. So you see that it all gets generated locally here on my workstation, then gets uploaded and gets deployed here. So if you look, first thing is code commit repository. You look over here, it's a code commit repository. So same thing. So if we were to look over at the pipeline, you've also got a template. And if we have a look over here, where is this one? This file. You've also got your code commit pipeline, and you've also got a code commit pipeline here. So everything is generated here. So we've got all the JSON files, but these are not how they are, I guess, defined by us. So those are the outputs. So what we normally do is we define the stack themselves in Python. So here we've just brought in the CDK library, and then we've defined in this stack, we've defined a repository, and we've just set it to retain the repository upon deletion. So what happens is these CDK commands actually look at this Python application code and then do a translation between Python and then CloudFormation JSON. That process of translation is known as synthesis. All right, so this is the repository. Then you've got another one for the pipeline stack. So the pipeline stack is here. It's importing a whole bunch more of different AWS components. And they are all defined down here. So you've got a CDK pipeline. You've got a stage. This is a deployment, a local deployment stage. But probably more interestingly is all of the environment variables have been mapped out at the top of each of these documents or scripts. Now, if you want to know which files need to be updated, I've left a list of all the files that do need to be updated. So under environments, this solution has been designed and configured for specific AWS accounts. And if you want to deploy it into a new AWS account, these following files and parameters need to be reviewed. So that's the app.py file, the following two files under the stacks directory, so pipeline stack and policy stack. So if you go into app.py file, you'd need to go in here and you need to probably duplicate these two blocks. You need a repository stack. So the repository stack, you need to update the account. So the account attached the name, the environment, so the target account number, the region that you want to deploy into, and then also the CDK qualifier. Now, if your CDK toolkit is using a different or custom S3 bucket location, then you'd also need to use this. So just going down here, this block has been set up for the RACQ base account. So this is the base account number. This is the branch that it's looking at the moment. That's the account number. That's the region. So Sydney region. This is saying that this is the qualifier that this solution needs to deploy using. So that's the CDK bootstrap qualifier. And then this is the custom S3 bucket for all of the CDK assets to be deployed into. All right. I'll just finish off with the pipeline. So the pipeline, also you need to update the different, I guess, environment variables. So you've got the account and then the environment name prefix. So each, I guess, account has been logically separate it into multiple environments within a single account. So you've got the analytics account, and we've just labeled that as development. You've got the base account, that's also labeled as development, but then you've got the production account, which has been separated into staging and production. So you need those two separated. And then, so these are all the VPC IDs. So these are being listed because when we want to create ENIs, which is Elastic Network Interfaces, we're going to have to lock it down to specific VPC IDs, and also we want to lock it down to specific subnets. And so that's the reason why we've listed both the VPC IDs and subnets. Then also we've got a few other things. We've got qualified dictionaries. So when you are doing a local deployment, so remember we've got our pipeline. Our pipeline takes the application code, builds it, and then tests it, and then deploys it into different locations. So in this solution, we're going to be deploying a copy of our resources locally, so within the analytics account. Then we want to probably do cross-account deployments. So you might want to deploy it into base, and then you might want to deploy it into staging and production following. So this has been set up in such a way that the qualified dictionary is just the qualifiers for the local environment, but then anytime that you're doing external account deployments, then it's saying, okay, for this analytics account, for the development environment, I'm going to deploy to this account. For staging and production, I want to deploy to these account numbers. So it just means all the, I guess, targets are being listed here from what is the, I guess, account number where the pipeline sits, and what's the target accounts that this pipeline needs to deploy into for each of these given, I guess, environment names. So these need to be updated, and also the qualifiers for each of these different target environments. All right, so here you can see that it went through the whole process of creating all these AWS resources, and it's listed everything that it's been doing and timestamps, and these are just the events that you see in CloudFormation. So if you go over here into events and then refresh, then you could see that this one, the update complete, corresponds with this one. So it finished at 6:08. That one, actually not sure if it corresponds. 8:42, maybe it's this one. Okay, so it corresponds to this one. All right. Then what happens is now we've got our code repository deployed, we've got our pipeline deployed. So that means we can go over to code pipeline and have a look at the pipeline that got deployed for us. So the pipeline is just there to make sure that each time that we go through the process of taking our code and wanting to deploy it into a target environment, that we follow the same exact steps. We take no shortcuts, and making sure that we follow the same consistent build process, and that we follow the same testing methodology, and we deploy everything consistently. So here we've got pipeline-cdk boundary-cross account. So pipeline, the repository, branch. And you can see here, it's got a link to code commit. And so each time you commit a change to code commit, it will trigger off a new pipeline run and do everything automatically for you. Here it does the build, so it synthesizes your Python application into CloudFormation JSON template. Update pipeline self-mutate. So what this does is it looks at your repository, and your repository also has a copy of what this pipeline itself should look like. So the pipeline stack, remember? So the pipeline stack defined this whole process, this 6-stage process. And so if you had happened to make any changes to the pipeline, not on the deployed version of the pipeline, but the actual code configuration in this file, it would look at that file, see if there's any changes that need to be applied, and then update itself. All right, so if there's no updates, then it goes to the next stage, and here it just runs through multiple stages before deploying your solution. So first thing is security check. So it actually runs through IAM to check, is this solution deploying or provisioning more permissions than previously was available? Now, since this is the first run, it will ask you to check those permissions. I don't know if it's done just yet. Anyway, this does the check, and then this next stage is the stage where it will wait for approval to be given. And so if, let's say I was just changing the README documentation in my repository, I saved that down, that kicked off a new pipeline process, that got to this point and ran the security check. And let's say I had already deployed my solution, it would have probably seen that I'm not actually making any changes to the permissions provisioned. I'm only changing some of the documentation. In that kind of scenario, it wouldn't actually wait for me to provide some, approval for it to continue, because I'm not changing the permissions. If I was changing the permissions, it should be able to detect those changes and then at least wait for me to click here to review it. If you want to review the changes, so that it gives you a link, this should open code build. And then in code build, if you scroll down, it will highlight all the permission changes that are being requested. And if you're okay with that, then click approve, and then it will go to the next stage. So next stage is creating a change set. So prepare. So if you go over to CloudFormation, you've got stack info, events, the resources that got deployed. But if you go all the way to change sets are just the templates that have been imported into the stack. The template has been reviewed and it's been compared to what has already been deployed. And then it will try and determine some sort of plan of action. Does it need to create new resources? Can it simply apply changes or modify existing resources, or does it need to delete resources to basically reflect your new template? All right. So what this is doing, it's got a new change set. It's imported it. If I click on the change set, you can see that it's identified that it needs to add all these different resources. Okay, so next thing is another approval stage. So even though it's a bit, lengthy and whatnot, this just gives you the opportunity to, pause for a moment and give you time to review what is actually being requested of this deployment. So it allows you to go back to your change set, look at these things and make some sort of judgment whether or not you want to proceed. Okay, if you're happy with that, then you can click review, approve. Now it goes to the deploy stage. And then if we click over here, now if we go to events, now you can see that it's in the creation stage, creation in progress. All right, so remember how I said that this thing has been set up to deploy to different environments. So remember how I've got this external accounts parameter. I might have my analytics account for the dev deployment. It deploys locally. Maybe for the staging, it deploys to the staging account. Let's say if this is being deployed into base, then the first deployment might be into itself, and then staging and production is into the production account. right? So basically it's doing 3 deployments for each pipeline. If you go back over to the pipeline, we ran through the first deployment. So this is the kind of like local deployment where we're deploying into its own account. If you scroll down further, you've got additional stages that deploy into staging, and then you've got an additional stage into production. So these are only possible if your target account has been bootstrapped, and so bootstrapped as in CDK bootstrapped, and also in that bootstrapping process you have specifically allowed and permitted the foreign account permissions to deploy resources into that account. So going back here, right, we've got our production account. Actually, this is the production account. So we want to deploy into this production account. So this means this production account needs to be CDK bootstrapped, but also needs to provide access to the base account. So this should be like this. So this base account has permissions to deploy into its own account, but then when it wants cross-account permissions to deploy into this production account for staging and production, you'll need to make sure that your production account has been bootstrapped and also has permissions, has specifically provided access to this account to deploy resources into its own account. All right. Now, we haven't actually set that up for analytics to deploy into base and production just yet, because this is the permission boundaries, and these permission boundaries are defining the fence. So you really wouldn't want analytics to define the fence and have the ability to extend and contract the permissions on demand. So this is all being done by infrastructure engineering, and so that's kind of the purpose for this demonstration today. All right, so what's next? So it's done the security check, manual approval, it's prepared the change set. I'm happy with the change set. It's actually finished deploying the resources. So if we go over to CloudFormation here, it should be complete. So it's deployed a new set of resources. And here you can see all the different resources that have been deployed. So you've got some CDK metadata, you've got 2 manage policies. So one for the deployment permission boundaries and one for the execution. Then you've got the actual policy documents, and then you've got some roles. So these roles are only used for testing purposes only, and they're not actually used for anything else. So these are just used to make sure that we can run the AWS-IAM-tester package. So basically running the AWS simulator. All right, so that's the last step on the pipeline. So remember how we've deployed it. Now we've got this thing called integration. It's actually just running the permission test. And if we were to click into it, here it's just pulling in a whole bunch of details. So it's actually pulling in the deployment role, deployment policy. So that's the permission boundaries for the deployment activities. And you've got execution role and execution policy. So that's the execution permission boundaries also. Then it's just installing a whole bunch of libraries, much like when we were doing on our virtual environment. Remember how we were setting up all the different libraries? It's not here anymore. But we were setting up all the different libraries, installing into Python. That's what this is doing here. It's repeating the same sort of thing. Here you can see some of the environment variables. So I've just did a print env. So that's print environment, so you can see all the environment variables that this code build process has access to. And you could see that I've passed in, say for example, the deployment policy, and that has a ARN linking directly to the deployment policy. Then here I've run a number of tests. So I'm just testing the AWS IAM tester, making sure that it's working. Here it's actually running through a bucket load of permission tests. And you can actually see all the permission tests are in the tests directory under permissions, config.yml. And here you can see all of the different test scenarios that are being tested for. So tests, and then under tests is the blocks of test cases. So this is one block. I'm testing all of these different S3 actions. I expect them to succeed, and I want to test them against these AWS resources. So these are two S3 buckets, and I'm just making sure that I can run all of these different types of AWS actions. So in this testing document, I've also listed kind of a description of what this test case is trying to achieve. So here you can outline all of the different test cases. You can also outline both succeed and failures. So here you've got another one. So when I've got a bucket that doesn't actually meet the naming standard, I want this test to fail, and fail in the creation and deletion of those buckets. So here I've got my two actions. So create bucket, delete bucket. I expect it to fail, and this is the bucket name. And this is because I've got fail in the naming. I should have an environment. So that's normally dev, staging, or prod. So that's another test case. So I've got passing and failing, or more like positive and negative testing. Now in the code build, I've also basically run the test twice. The second run is just to show the test results themselves. So this is in debug mode. I'm running this command. So this is AWS IAM tester config file. So I'm pointing to the config.yml file, and I've set it to debug mode. So it actually prints out a bunch of information for you to read. So that first test case is here. So it's running the config for all of these different S3 actions. And then the resources here, you can see it against these two S3 buckets. And then you've got the same sort of thing for here, I believe. You've got run config, create and delete bucket for this resource. And then this is telling you the role that is being used in this test, and it's saying it's a success. So you can use all of this information to get a feel of what's passing and what's failing, the both positive and negative tests, and all of these have been outlined here. This is all the test results. Okay. So if there's no findings found, then that means all of the test cases that we have defined in this document, which is already almost 1,000 lines long, of all of these actions, resources, and expected results. All right, and yeah, so that was the permission test. And once you're happy with that, then you can continue approval, but I'm going to reject it this time because I don't want it to attempt to deploy into staging and production. These actually might not point to the production account I think it points to a different account. I'm not actually sure where it points to, but as I said, you go back to your pipeline. For this 310 account, it's pointing to 075. That's actually my own personal account that is pointing to. So I was testing cross-account deployment activities from the analytics development environment into my own personal account. All right, so that's how it's been set up. All the documentation is in readme.md. It's all done in Markdown. So it's got summary of what this solution does, some of the features in this solution, versions, installation notes, some of the commands that you might need to run to install the, required applications. So things like Cdk, AWS CLI, Node.js, and Python, all of those might be required. If you're using Cloud9 environment, just make sure you update your CDK. This is a few commands to help you create the virtual environment as we did at the very beginning. Also the command to install all the required libraries. Notes on where to find the updates for each of the environments. And then also some of the common CDK commands that you might need to run to deploy everything. So remember, in this solution, we deployed the repository, we deployed the pipeline, and then it's the pipeline itself that will go ahead and deploy locally to its own AWS account. And then in the future, we'll do the cross-account deployments into staging and production. And then here, I'm going to leave a link to this video recording. And yeah, any further information, it's all found in the doc folder. So in the, so that's docs with the S. And then you've got a bit of documentation. It's simply just a bit of documentation at the very beginning, a bit of summary of what this thing is doing, and then it just externalizes the comments of what each of these blocks is doing. All right, so that's just trying to help you with actually reviewing the code itself. All right, that's it.